Hi, my name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis. We are the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival, and we're pleased to be joined for a conversation about the Annotated Field Guide of Ulysses S. Grant by Jim Finn, the director. Jim's a former St. Louisan, and we actually honored him a couple years back with our Cinema St. Louis Award. So he'll have some things, I'm sure, to say. We'll ask him eventually about where he went to high school so we can get that required question out of the way, but we'll first start with the film. So Jim, this film, your work is oftentimes sort of avant-garde and experimental in nature, and this film certainly shares some of those characteristics, but it's somewhat more of a straight-ahead documentary than what we're used to seeing from you, although it does again deal with historical figures that you oftentimes explore in your work. So I just wanted to talk about the origins, why you decided you wanted to tackle this particular subject at this particular time.
Right. So I had read a new Sherman biography that came out a couple years ago, and the new Turnout Grant biography. And being a middle-aged white man, it's my duty to be up on all these, historical American figures. And then my grandfather died a few years back, and I ended up with all the things that nobody else wanted, which was like sort of maps, postcards, some old books. And he had maps of the military parks, and he had a book about Vicksburg. And it was very positive about Grant, and it was written in the 1950s. And it wasn't a particularly remarkable book, but what was interesting to me was how kind of positive it was about Grant. When the kind of understanding that I grew up with in the 70s and 80s was more Grant was a, kind of the butcher, the kind of like hack guy that got the job done, but a lot of people died and nobody wanted to be in his army, etc. And so I thought that was interesting. And then I didn't even realize how many military parks there were. I guess I had thought there were maybe monuments or something like that. And so I really started mapping out where he went and looking at these kind of key elements of his kind of gutting of the Confederacy, so to speak. But then as my research took me around, I looked at, there were these key kind of battle sites that were now under the river or were kind of lost to history, and then there were other elements that I talk about in the film, like the fact that the massive spy network of African Americans, of enslaved and formerly enslaved people, gave the Union side incredible intelligence as to what the Confederate Army was doing. And basically they couldn't trust any white person in the South, and they could trust every Black person, almost universally, every Black person that would say something, they would be right. And so that was like something that I came up in my research. It was really, really interesting. And so I thought, well, let's just see where this thing takes us. And so I took my Bolex camera, 16mm camera, got a bunch of film and got some sound equipment and went on the road, right? Which is, just a few months before COVID, luckily.
Obviously when you're tackling anything related to the Civil War from a documentary point of view, a long shadow is going to be cast over it by Ken Burns' Civil War series. You obviously had to think about that when you were approaching it. You were never going to make a film that was going to be similar to what Ken Burns does. But I'm curious as to, one, what your reaction was to the Civil War. And then two, did you see your film at all as being almost a response on some levels to what he did?
Well, I think, just as a documentary, it's a fine, excellent documentary. I would say it's, it really kind of inspired people to get interested in it, et cetera, et cetera. The huge flaw in the documentary is, is Shelby Foote, who's the kind of de facto narrator of the film. And he is essentially, his take on Nathan Bedford Forrest, on the Southern sort of way of life, and his own, this idea of the Confederacy as this kind of, lost cause. He's not exactly lost cause, but he's pretty close to it, and his views have dated very badly in the last 20 years. And so again, I think that there is this kind of like way that we had to respect this white supremacist viewpoint that was not really understood at the time. I think he recognizes it probably now more. So it's not that I sort of take on my film as a critique of his or as a response, but I do feel like there are some possibilities for new ways of thinking about it. Of course, the biggest challenge is, and then right as I'm coming out with this, I think Leonardo DiCaprio came up with a big kind of Civil War biography, bio documentary, whatever you call it, about Grant, with a lot of reenactments, stuff like that. And he touched upon some of the things that were Milliken's Bend, different kind of moments that were in my film that were not included in many other Civil War documentaries. But mine is very different. It's more of a kind of, as you said, avant-garde, but really also just kind of, I feel like there's a kind of a travelogue vibe of my film where you can just kind of jump in and go, what is this? And then of course I used games. The other challenge was, do I go with the reenactor thing? Or, I'm not getting a budget to do reenactments. I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in that. And well, maybe I'd be interested if you gave me many, many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars. It could be fun to do, actually. I'm interested. But I wasn't going to do that. So I'm like, all right. And then, of course, the reenactor problem, and I've been to reenactments of Revolutionary War, Civil War, et cetera. And then kind of, I've also been to like artistic, there's also like there's a new kind of more revisionist and radical versions of these, which are awesome. But they're kind of a different thing. And I thought there is this subculture of war games that really came out of the 1960s and 70s. And it really was split off from, Dungeons and Dragons is one version that kind of was, he begged Avalon Hill to, Gary Gygax, sorry, really wanted Avalon Hill to be, you guys got to get involved. This is going to be great. They were like, no, this is just, dwarves, elves. I don't know what you're talking about. And so they blew it and they kind of stayed with our historical gaming. And that has developed that now, of course, there's a new kind of, there's like this renaissance of these board games now where it kind of went out of fashion. There was like 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s, maybe. And then it sort of kind of bubbled up again in the 90s. And now there's just like, I used the one of the Battle of Belmont, Missouri, actually. There's a beautifully illustrated game that was in a magazine called Paper Wars. And I just loved it. I was like, oh my God. The game itself is very complicated. And I'm sure if the designer looked at how I move the chits around in my animation, he might be a little bit annoyed because it's not the way you're supposed to do it. But I really love it. And I just love this kind of new subculture. I actually went to a board game convention where they were doing it. I was going to film it and be part of it. And then there's just this problem of like kind of obese American white men. And once you start down that road, you just can't help but mock them or seem like you're mocking them or be like, I'm not mocking them. I'm going to take them seriously. And so I'm just like, I'm just going to leave it out. So I dropped that part of it. Which might be disappointing to people, but it's in there. I love the game part of it, and that's kind of how I illustrate the games too. There's also how do you illustrate these battles now, and now it's like these digital. Either you do reenactments and you do like digital stuff, and that's cool. But I really want to do it in a little different way. Kind of give this kind of shout out to this kind of obscure hobbyist subculture.
Well, of course, you have an ongoing interest in games, apparently, since you developed one for your last film that worked in conjunction with it, that you were the game master. So clearly, this is something that fascinates you, not just with regard to Civil War gaming, but outside of that. Do you play these games on a regular basis?
So I do. I play, now in COVID, I'm playing like 3 kind of Zoom role play games. I go to conventions sometimes. And I do love kind of more of the kind of Euro board games and like kind of quirky, like children's cool with my kids, kind of Settlers of Catan, those kind of games. And there's a lot of them. There's this new Wingspan, this like kind of book about building, or a game about building kind of bird sanctuaries or something. So there's a lot of like great, I love that stuff. And I think I just kind of wanted to get it into my film. And, really, I think the biggest stretch for me in this film was using my voice as a voiceover, and that made me nervous. And we worked on the writing of the voiceover, the editing of the voiceover. We redid the voiceover a number of times. We tightened it up and built the sound design and the music, and then went back and did all that. 6 months just on the music, on the sound and music, and about 6 months prepping for filming, doing all that. So it's about a year of the whole thing. And it definitely took me, it definitely was a lot of fun to work on the sound for that long. And I wonder if, sort of being trapped in coronavirus world may have helped keep that focus longer. I don't know. Sure.
Well, it's an unusual choice initially when you think about it, because you aren't thinking of a Civil War documentary as being a personal story, but because as you pointed out, it's also something of a travelogue. You're going to visit these various sites, and you position yourself as the person who's sort of visiting those sites as the filmmaker, and that's an entry point for talking about larger issues, which you do consistently throughout. It's not like the focus is on you, but you do, I think, become a part of the story in a more essential way than, you're not forcing yourself into it. It was a natural evolution in the approach.
Yeah, I mean, also, I think, there's something about being from St. Louis where, when you have like people like Trump right now during the election, or, kind of really conservative kind of humor, and, I know all of it. I know it. I grew up with it. Missouri. I grew up in Missouri in the 70s. Nothing surprises me. But at the same time, there's this kind of progressive. I also grew up in U City. So I'm like, I had this like real progressive kind of strain on the one hand, and then I was around a lot of more conservative people, and it was racially separate, but also we lived very close to Black people. And so there was this sort of like, what happened? How did we get here? What is this thing? It's just not something you really talk about. It's something that happened 150, 170 years ago. And so I think, it really seemed very, very relevant to me to go back and look at this story and use the kind of biography or the years of Grant as an entree point, like using the kind of like, let's just say the years between, Grant starting in living in St. Louis, chopping firewood, and, being kind of broke till he, is the kind of oversees the liberation of the South from the Confederacy of the United States, from this kind of like tumor, this white supremacist tumor that took over a third or a half maybe of the United States. And let's go to those locations and tell that story, and then look at these little side things that happen. I mean, what to get into was on the one hand, I was sort of tempted to only do things that we didn't know about. Like Milliken's Bend was this battle where it was one of the first battles where African Americans fought, and they lost. They were losing, but in a sense, they technically lost the battle probably, but they chased away the Texas Confederate Army, and that army was badly wounded because the Black soldiers fought in ways that was unexpected. And so, but then that site was lost under the Mississippi. And of course, then during segregation years, there were monuments that were melted down during World War I, for example. And so, and then of course, then you've got like segregation South, and they're not going to redo it. And so it was very interesting, how to kind of look at this stuff. And then again, even just a battle, which was a small battle, Belmont, Missouri. It was Grant's first battle, which I talk about in the film. And that town is gone now. It's underneath the Mississippi. And so there's really not much there. There's a big monument on the Kentucky side, which talks about how great, the Confederacy was at that point. Because again, the Confederacy technically won that battle. Grant left. But they didn't really win because, of course, Grant got a lot of experience, and he got his troops out, and he learned a lot from the battle. And, so anyway, that was sort of like one of the ideas. And then also just quickly, I knew that Sherman was buried in St. Louis, but I did not know why. And I went out to his grave in a amazing, brilliant snowstorm. I was so lucky to get in December because I was home for Christmas to visit my parents. And I just did not imagine I would be able to get a snowstorm in Christmas in St. Louis, Christmas time. It was 2019. There was this kind of a weird snowstorm that happened, and went out there and went to Grant's, of course, Grant's near Grant's farm, but his old mansion or house that he lived in. And then found out that Sherman was buried there because his son had died while he was at Vicksburg. As he brought him to Vicksburg, he got sick. He went back and died there. And so when Sherman died many years later, he wanted to be buried alongside his son. And I love that story and put it in the film. So just there were small stories like that I think aren't really known. And of course that humanizes him because, Sherman has kind of the reputation of being a crank, whether you love him as like, yeah, he kicked their ass, he's great, or like, oh, Sherman burned the mansion. I mentioned that he shot the plantation dogs, and he was like, they were very angry about him killing dogs. Oh, he shot the dogs. Well, yeah, the dogs were trained to hunt humans and take them down, and he shot them, which was awesome. You should shoot those dogs. I'm so happy that he did that.
You're going to get us in trouble with the folks who love animals.
There was no rehabbing those dogs in the 1860s. Let's be real. Sorry.
I want to talk a little bit about the visual approach that you take to the film. You already referenced the fact that you reenact the battles using board games and using stop motion animation, which I thought was really a clever, fascinating way of...
Clever? Is that the right word? Insane. Time-consuming, difficult. Why?
There's a charmingly homemade aspect of it too. But you also use other sort of pop cultural artifacts, trading cards, illustrations, things of that nature. Was again a conscious decision that you didn't want to use like historical photos from the time and do the pans that we're used to seeing from Burns films, that you wanted to find an alternative way of presenting this material. And then of course you use a lot of material from your visits to the historical sites, oftentimes holding on shots for decent amounts of time to let things sort of unfold. I always think of that, other filmmakers do it too, but I always think of that as sort of Herzogian in its approach. So talk a little bit about the evolution of how you decided you wanted to approach the visuals of the film.
Yeah, I mean, if you have like 16 millimeter film is very pretty. And if you're going to go there and shoot it, you just might as well if you're going to put a tripod, you just might as well let it hang on for a little bit longer than you need it to. And then you can decide what you want to do or not. So that's part of it. Of course, one of the problems is, the most beautiful shot in the film is not in the film because the film jammed. And I went on top of Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, and I got the river where Grant crossed to come in and open up the cracker line, as they call it, in the Chattanooga. The Confederacy after Chickamauga had bottled up the Union Army, and they were starving and threatening to surrender. And Grant kind of opened up this food line and kind of relieve the siege. And then of course, and I talk about this in the film about what the Battle of Chattanooga was. And I got a beautiful shot, the clouds at dawn. I don't love getting up before dawn. I just don't. I've been doing it for years because I have young kids. But your kids get a certain age, you're like, yes, I don't have to get up before dawn anymore. And then, you have to do it for your film. But I did. I got up before dawn. I got a shot, and the film did not. It just jumped in the frame. It didn't register. I was like so sad. But it's what you get. You get what you get. So I did get some beautiful shots, but then I'd be like, oh, I want to come. Of course, like Shiloh, I shot that in November. Well, the battle was in April, so there's the peach blossom. It was like during the battle. The sort of ironic thing of the battle is it would have been the most beautiful time of year in Tennessee, and that's not what it looks like in my movie. So there's some poetic, like you just like. I can't go back there 5 times. I had some money from a small grant I got, and I'm like, let's go and do this. And so I did. I was concerned that I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to focus on. And then I knew I also would have liked to have gone to Mexico because Grant, of course, started in Mexico. And then I realized if I just go to the Texas border, that is Mexico, or was Mexico back then before the war, And so I love that idea of like going, and I found these channel markers. And then I actually was looking for, there's a road marker down there that's still from the 1860s, a stone road marker. I found one of the Mason-Dixon line markers, which is easier to find. But the stone marker, didn't get it in the film because I couldn't find it until later.
Oh.
Somebody did some internet sleuthing for me and found it after I was already back in Alabama or something, coming back. So that I wasn't turning around again. I did get all the way to the Texas border. That's as far as I went from, and then I shot in Boston Harbor, where one of the vice president, Alexander Stevens, was imprisoned. So that's part of the film too, kind of like how the kind of way that the Confederacy, that the people did not really acknowledge they did anything wrong ever. They just abdicated all responsibility, and
You ignored the trading cards and some of the illustrations.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about the trading cards. Let me get to that really quick. I don't know how I got distracted by that. The trading cards, reminded me of, I used to put the garbage pail kid stickers on my door, which my mom let me do that, which I appreciate that, Mom. But I'm sort of surprised she did in retrospect, because they were really disgusting. And then I thought about that, and that was like a kid growing up in whenever those were, the early 80s or late 70s or whatever. And then, the kind of like generation before me, the early 60s, those kids grew up with these, disgusting visions of the Civil War, like impaled bodies and alligators chewing on the corpses of these kinds of things. And so I really loved that idea of kind of like thinking about the different, the kind of board game. This is a serious tactical way that Nathan Bedford Forrest moved his army here, and how all that can be sort of removed. On the one hand, it's really just like acknowledging the pop cultural understanding over the years that we've had, and then also thinking about it maybe a somewhat critical way, but in a kind of a quirky, funny way, thinking about like the ways that we've been sort of propagandized. I love that, of course, the looters, the way that Sherman's march is just like the horny Yankees, it's all about the horny Yankees from Gone with the Wind. And it's just like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, they were like crazy white supremacists who were like, we're going to have our slaves. Like, we have to enslave people. It's our right to enslave. It's so insane that they were so arrogant. And they were like, how dare he, and they, I did actually, it was like, there was, of course, sexual assault. And I'm like, how do I get into that stuff? And it's very, how many different ways do you get in and out? And I did sort of acknowledge, I would say, it's not a hagiography of Grant by any means. I acknowledge the anti-Semitism, which is always a minor footnote in any Grant biography. Oh, he did this little thing. And of course, it is a footnote because Lincoln was like, what the hell are you doing, man? And he undid it. But if Lincoln had let that go, if Lincoln were like a little bit of a weaker person, or, missed it, quote unquote, and let it go, it would have been a stain on his presidency, a serious stain, in the same way, Roosevelt's, the Japanese internment camps were for the Roosevelt administration. Ethnically cleansing a huge section of the United States of Jewish people would have been insane. And I explain it in the movie a bit about what it meant. But I also love that when it didn't work, and Grant just was like, he just kind of shrugged, pretended it didn't happen, and just went back to work, which is what he did with all of his mistakes. And then, people brought it up again and again and again. People brought up his mistakes. Cold Harbor, the General Orders Number 11, which was the order to banish all Jewish people from like Kentucky, Mississippi, et cetera. And they brought it up in campaigns against him and things like that. And he had to talk about it for the rest of his life. And the way he got Jewish men in his cabinet, he was very savvy. He did everything he needed to do. He was like, yeah, I just, he just did the right thing later, which is something, which is not nothing.
Uh, let's talk a little bit about your use of sound and music, which is obviously very important to you in all of your films. Talk a little bit about your collaborators with regard to the music and composition, and also your choice of how to approach sound design in a film like this.
Well, so when I'm doing the sound, I try to do as much work as I can. So I collect a lot of the Foley sound effects. For this film it's 16 millimeters. So I brought a recorder with me, but I did not get very much usable stuff, and that's because I was really trying to run, get shot after shot. I was like, oh, the sun's going down, I gotta do this. Oh no, it's raining. Oh, this is good, it's raining, I gotta go get another shot because it's raining. These kinds of things. And so you just don't have any. I was by myself, and so there was no time to do sound, and so I had to build all the sound later. And then I'm trying to figure out, well, would these birds be here? What is that bird? What is it? Is that right? What about wing flaps? All this kind of stuff. So, a lot of times you think of a sound designer, they would do all that. But I don't have a lot of money. And by the time I'm done shooting my films, I have even less money. And so if I'm going to pay someone to do sound design, I want to pay them to do things that I can't do. And, it's not fun, but it's not that hard to get wing flaps and line them up if you have access to all these sound effects, which I did. And so, I did all the basic Foley work. My idea when I do sound is that I get it so it sounds good to me, because I'm kind of like a dummy when it comes to sound. I'm just like, okay, that's good. I'm like, okay, I got it. And I'm ready to move on. And so when I get it that good enough to me, which is, a little better than mediocre, then I can pass it on to my sound editors, and then they can really start to do really interesting things with it. They can get different kinds of Foley maybe, or they can start, the way that kind of you can shift the sound, kind of go in and out. We did a few things. I did the Chits movie, and I just did rat footsteps. I did rat footsteps. They kind of added it, made it a little bit more elaborate. And then, of course, the other thing with sound was the recording of the Rebel Yell. Now, if you can go on the internet and listen to the Rebel Yell, different recordings, and it's always very charming. It's these old men, and people are laughing. They're like, "That's so cool, the Rebel Yell! Wow." The first people that heard the Rebel Yell it was not good, because they were probably going to die. The first people that heard it were on the front lines, and they were probably not surviving that day, or they were not surviving it with all their limbs intact, because the bullets that they used were, the guns that they used were much more accurate, and the bullets were much more brutal and lethal. And so it was really the first war where they just everything just got ripped apart. It took them till the end of the war to really figure out how to fight properly, because the first couple of years they were fighting in the old early 19th century way of fighting, which was a terrible way of doing it. And so I think, I told my sound designers that I do not want any bullet sounds at all. There cannot be any battle, no guns, no explosions, because of course, in every Civil War movie, it's and then for the music, I played Ashkan Farewell, the Ken Burns, and I was like, whatever the opposite of that is, do it. I mean, it's a great song, but of course, the theme of that song really goes along with the kind of brothers, they were fighting American and American. It's like, it's not exactly accurate. There weren't a lot of black people fighting against black people. Most of them were either forced to work for the South because they were enslaved by insane white people, or they were trying to get the fuck out of the area, or they were actively fighting on the Union side. Those were the kind of options. And so when you talk about that brothers fighting brothers, you're talking about white people, and it's a real fantasy that came about after the Lost Cause. We have to acknowledge this kind of white supremacist ideology as something that's valid. And of course, that's coming around differently now. But when you have people who talk about, the great General Lee or something like that, these are all standard things that we all understood. So I think the music, I also at the end, when I passed it on to the sound designers and they were doing their fun work with it, over early in the summer, I just watched every Kinji Fukasaku gangster Yakuza film that he made in the 1970s, which are all amazing. They're crazy violent, really brilliant films. And they have great soundtracks. And I really was just like, this is just like a kind of energy that I want, this kind of like 70s kind of synth and kind of like, and so we looked at a number of examples of it, and the music, Colleen Burke does the music she's worked on music. I've been collaborating with her for a number of years, and she lives, her husband Manoff is a musician, and she had another musical drummer in her pod upstairs, this guy Ben Hall, and then she finally needed this little guitar for the song. There was one acoustic guitar she really wanted, and she has a baby, and I was like, look, you got to be safe, man. This is like at the height, it's like in Michigan in June or May, and the COVID thing was really bad. I was like, just get what you can get, whatever. And she got this guy to come out, and she looped a microphone out to the tree, and then she was in the studio recording it, and he was out. He was like a 12-foot, cord or something, cable. So that was just amazing. Those kinds of things happened, and just trying to get the film together, and then really, in the way I work is that I try to find the film when it's in, when in the editing. I have an idea of where it's going, but I also find it in the editing and in the, when we're doing the sound.
Right. We should wrap things up here, but I wanted to ask one last question, and that is, obviously, as I noted, this is a little bit of a departure for you from the type of film that you made. It obviously has lots of roots in the other things that you've done, but are you inclined to do more documentary work as you move forward, or are you going to return to your more avant-garde past?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Right now, I have a new project that's a little bit weirder. It's kind of like a little mini sci-fi kind of thing that I'm working on at the moment. I'm open to it. It was actually a lot of fun, and it was the kind of approach of trying to take a more personal take on history and kind of like an approach that kind of goes at it from one angle, looks like you're making this film about this man, this kind of biography, but then actually kind of like moves in all these sort of strange directions, was really a lot of fun. So I'm open to, we'll see.
All right, and I promised to sip at the top. So where'd you go to high school, Jim?
Well, I went to a few schools. I traveled around the Catholic education, and I went to Our Lady of Lourdes grade school, and then I briefly went to St. Louis Priory. I was asked to leave. I had some discipline problems there. I went to another Jesuit high school called De Smet, which still exists, of course. I also had some problems there, and I finally graduated from Christian Brothers College, CBC, when they were in Richmond Heights in the old days. Which was
they imposed that military discipline on you, obviously.
Yes. That was actually that school was okay because it was much more diverse, and there was a little bit more room in the 80s for kind of weirdos at that school, surprisingly, because I don't know, even though I had this military thing, whatever. Anyway.
Well, good. We got that question resolved. It was more complex than I was anticipating. You were clearly a bit of a hellraiser as a youngster.
By today's standards, it would be nothing, but there was just, I think it was just issues with Catholicism and authoritarianism that didn't work out for me.
We can have a personal conversation about that later. All right, Jim, this was great. I very much appreciate you taking the time to talk about your film, and I hope people who have seen it and have listened to you now recommend it to others. And where is it likely to eventually become available to people?
We'll see. It's being distributed by Video Art, my Video Art distributor, the VDB, Video Data Bank. It's playing at Doc Leipzig in Germany, Doc Lisboa, and St. Louis Film Festival. And then we'll see where it goes. It's hopefully going to travel around the festival circuit, and then we'll see where it lands.
Right.
Thanks so much.
probably going to have a life from an educational point of view, educational film, which would be very unusual for some of the stuff that you've done in the past.
See, we'll see.
Right. Thanks again.
Thanks, Cliff.